Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Big rumours on Lewis Hamilton's future with Ferrari after a challenging start to his tenure with the Scuderia so far. Rumours have suggested there's a controversial clause in his contract which allows him to effectively call the shots as to what that future looks like. Yes, he's had a difficult last couple of Grand Prix weekends. Some therefore have even suggested, could Ferrari consider moving on early? But apparently Hamilton has all of the power and Ferrari have none when it comes to these contract discussions going forward, in addition to the fact that there are some positive noises continuing to emerge about Ferrari's car in 2026 and beyond. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Now, talking of driver stuff, we're going to begin here. We've done it quite a lot over the last few days, and I've got another one for you all, but this is actually more of a solidified report. The last few days we've seen Perez, Bottas, Mick Schumacher, what's going on at Cadillac. But the latest report is that it's Perez, and this is coming out of Thomas Maher from Planet F1. It's actually a pretty serious report at this point, and to be fair, other journalists have said this for some time, but he thinks that Perez is closing in on a return. The prevailing wisdom is that they will choose one experienced driver and one lesser experienced driver, so take it as you will, but Perez to Cadillac, it's very likely. It's been very likely for a long period of time. Is it going to happen? Who knows? But people are now starting to talk about it in even more aggressive fashion than they were before. Now, many of the drivers have controversial opinions, or let's say differing opinions, on the controversial 2026 regulations. Charles Leclerc drove it in the sim. He wasn't very happy about it. Hamilton is more positive on the changes. He's generally just happy and finds it fascinating that the cars are going to be so different and they keep on changing. We talked about it yesterday, the reports that the drivers in the simulator have to drive these cars very differently to how they do the current regs, just because of the way that the energy is getting deployed. It's a big learning curve for the drivers. Some will be better at it and others won't be. Hamilton says it's fascinating, the changes. And at least based on his simulator time, assuming that he's done a fair bit of it with Ferrari, because all the other drivers most certainly have, feels maybe a little bit more optimistic than other drivers about the, let's say, characteristics of the car. Getting rid of the Venturi tunnel, so the ground effect is pretty much nowhere near as big of a factor next year. I also like getting rid of the wheel covers as well. I think the car looks a lot more aesthetic without them, to be perfectly honest. Intrigued to your thoughts on that. But Hamilton doesn't seem dissatisfied with the way the regulations are going. And maybe part of that is because he's just not got along particularly well with these ground effect era cars. That could very much change next year, according to reports. This I thought was interesting, looking at the fastest pit stop of the season per driver. Now, you could look at the average data, of course, but that will be skewed by maybe not penalties exactly, but damage replacing front wings or, in the wet, for example. But if you look at the fastest pit stops, you will find the following. So Piastri and Norris and Tsunoda have all had pit stops under 2 seconds. Norris and Piastri's one happened last time out. Leclerc's had a 2 flat. Hamilton's had a 2.07. Max has had a 2.11. Lawson with a 2.12. So, a lot of the teams are getting down into the mix again after the changes they made a couple of years ago to the way the pit stops happen. The fact that we've got this many teams down to the 2-second barrier, if not even marginally underneath, is pretty remarkable. It's also interesting that both Piastri and Norris had apparently exactly 1.94 second pit stops. Do we believe that? It's like that famous race, the European Grand Prix in 1997, where there were 3 drivers tied exactly to the 1,000th. Felt a little surprising to me in terms of timings that both Norris and Piastri at the same Grand Prix had exactly the same time. It's not to say it's impossible, but, sometimes I question these timings. But maybe that's just the human brain not really wanting to appreciate randomness in the way that it actually works. But if you look higher up, you'll find Sainz has the slowest, fastest stop of the season. Albon is at much faster at a 2.42. Alonso's fastest is a 2.44. So gives you a reasonable perception of where the teams are really, because Stroll's had a 2.37, but there's only a couple of teams that are banging in 2.4s and above, and that is Aston Martin, really. It's Williams and it's Haas. Doing at a 2.47, he wasn't around for very long to really say. Colapinto's had a faster one, Gasly's had a faster one, so Alpine are doing an okay job, at least in terms of general performance, but it is interesting some of the discrepancies between drivers sometimes. I think you'd even see this with Verstappen and Perez. I don't know the numbers on this, but it feels like over the time that Perez and Verstappen were teammates that often Perez would get marginally faster stops, because if the driver is just really precise with where they stop on their marks, they can gain, half a tenth or whatever on maybe their teammate if they're just a little bit more accurate. These are the fastest pit stops ordered though, like that. So Piastri and Norris back in Hungary. Tsunoda as well was in Hungary with a 1.97. And then Leclerc, and Hamilton in Jeddah. So, as I say, Leclerc just seems a little bit more precise than Hamilton this year, so he's getting slightly faster pit stop times on average, and Tsunoda also seems pretty on point with his marks as well. But it's McLaren, it's Ferrari, and it's Red Bull, right? And to be fair, McLaren were in the picture here, but before this past weekend's, they actually weren't the quickest until they decided to take that record as well from the season. Plenty to get into, though, elsewhere. Quickly on Mercedes, we know that they've struggled lately. Their rear axle, the new one they brought, was an absolute shambles. There are big questions on what's going to happen next season in 2026. Who's going to get the regulations right? Jacques Villeneuve comes out with another quote. Effectively, what Villeneuve is saying here is that he doesn't expect that Mercedes' advantage, if it is to exist at all on an engine side, to be anywhere near as substantial as it was back in 2014. And that's understandable, right? I mean, Mercedes, they really had nailed it in 2014, and they had a bit of a head start. They weren't really expected by many to be too much of a competitive force. People were overlooking them a little bit. For 2026, I think Villeneuve is probably correct that teams should be better prepared, and you wouldn't expect the gap in power units next year to be a second a lap, for example, as even sometimes it felt like it was with that Mercedes. It was also an excellent car aerodynamically, and people often seem to forget that in 2014, 16, etc. But it's not like their engine was weak. I mean, the duel in the desert, Bahrain that year, was a phenomenal example of exactly that towards the end of the Grand Prix. That's the Mercedes piece. How close can Ferrari get? Will Ferrari have the best engine next year? Is it going to be Mercedes as we expect? Or is it going to come down a lot to reliability, the integration of the power unit with the rest of the chassis? That's why I was interested when Toto Wolff was asked the question on who he thinks is going to be their chief competitor next year, and he didn't say McLaren, he said Ferrari. Maybe Mercedes are confident that McLaren are going to struggle with the integration, and therefore they're going to drop down a little bit, whereas Mercedes are going to be the fastest Mercedes-powered car yet again. I think reliability is going to be a crucial factor next season, and maybe you would take an engine which is a little bit slower but at least more reliable over the course of a year. But who do I expect to be more reliable, Mercedes or Ferrari? It's obviously a bit of a no-brainer, right? Given what we saw, for example, in 2022, when things were shaking up and the Ferrari was struggling. There's rumours that Red Bull powertrains, their engine is fast, but it's particularly unreliable in their current testing, let's say. So that's going to be a key issue. But 2026 is a massively important season for everyone. And just a couple of races into the season, we are going to see chaos, I'm sure, in the market, because it will become very clear who are the best teams, who are the weaker teams, and who's to blame for some of their issues, right? Because Christian Horner will be sitting on the sidelines, I'm sure, around about March next year and getting some phone calls from teams that have, let's say, not nailed the start of the new regulations. But Ferrari have to focus to some extent on finishing these set of regulations as strongly as they possibly can. McLaren believe that Ferrari can be competitive on certain weekends. I mean, we saw that in Hungary. They have it within them, but in order for them to have that, it seems they have to run the car a little bit too low, and therefore they had to raise it dramatically in the final stint. Now, there was some further discussion on this from the guys at Auto Racer, that this is not an unusual thing, right? Pretty much what they say is that a number of teams do this, right? Like, every team plays with the tyre pressures to preserve the skid, and what they suggest in the article is that over the course of the Grand Prix, the teams will raise the pressures of the tyres stint after stint, because as the fuel burns off, they need to kind of counteract that by increasing the tyre pressures in order to keep the car at the optimal ride height. So it's a real fascinating game that all these teams are playing, but pretty much what they say is that every team is doing this. It's just Ferrari, for whatever reason, which you might speculate on, when they did this at the end of the race, it completely destroyed their competitiveness. So that's what De Kester and the guys say, is that yes, they did raise the car using tyre pressures at the end of the Grand Prix, but they're expecting those losses to only be maybe 0.3 a lap at max. But instead, they were losing 1.5 seconds per lap instead. Now, there's a couple of, interesting ways to look at this, I suppose. The article went on to say that they increased the tyre pressures by 1.5 psi in the final stint. That's what the teams usually do, to raise the ride height by about 1 millimeter to prevent the skid wear. This has become common among the teams. It always has a compromise in terms of load and grip, however, by increasing the tyre pressures in that sense. Now, for Leclerc, assuming they also did this, they are surprised that the car fell out of the window so much and so dramatically in the final stint. A couple of explanations. Maybe there was some damage to the chassis, but it's not like Ferrari have come out and said that. Or they raised the tyre pressures by more than the number that we've heard mentioned there, because they knew that they were very, very much on the limit, and maybe instead of raising it by 1.5 psi, they raised it by substantially more. It cost them way more downforce, possibly. Or, I guess another explanation is that the car is just fundamentally flawed and they don't really understand why they lost so much performance by playing around with the tyre pressures, but they did. And Auto Racer pretty much say that, yeah, they might have changed the new rear suspension, it's better than it was before, but the car is effectively unsolvable, right? Like, this is a Rubik's Cube that is not able to be finished. Someone's taken off the stickers and swapped them around. And it's, you're not able to fix this car. There are errors deeply rooted in the project that make it not possible to completely recover. Could it still win a race? I think it's possible, but it's certainly not going to turn up and magically win the majority from now to the end of the year, because it's just fundamentally a deeply flawed project. Ferrari took a lot of risk this season. They changed 99% of their car and it's backfired on them pretty spectacularly. Now, where does Hamilton have to fit in all of this? Because clearly the main issue for Ferrari this season has not been their drivers, it's been the car. And they're still second in the championship because their drivers generally have done a good job. Has Leclerc had his difficult weekends? Yes. Has, let's say qualifying sessions, Leclerc hasn't been as, let's say, dominant and consistent as he typically would expect to be. Maybe part of that is on the car, and Hamilton's had a difficult time this season. Nobody's denying that, but it's also not a massive surprise. Joins Ferrari, so much adaptation to be had on the engine side, on the engine braking side, on the whole team environment, on the way that the car is fundamentally designed. So many other things that Hamilton had to adapt to. Vasseur even said that they underestimated the level of challenge that required. And also he's coming into Leclerc's team, and against Leclerc, who's one of the quickest drivers on the grid, if not the fastest. So I think Hamilton's done a reasonable job, all things considered. He's had his highs, not that many of them, and he's certainly had his lows in recent weekends, and some of the comments he's made publicly about things like, they should replace me, or there's interesting things happening behind the scenes that I don't want to talk about, those have definitely, let's say, revved up the community interest. Now, Hamilton apparently is requesting some additional changes. For the foreseeable future, it remains to be seen how Maranello's players will be managed following the recent confirmation of Vasseur to stay on. Alongside Fred's reappointment, Hamilton would like some variations in the technical and human management of the team that oversees the car's operations, especially on the track. So it's pretty interesting that Hamilton doesn't feel like some of the operational side of the team, and it's probably fair enough and justified really, is really delivering as they should be. So Hamilton, now that Vasseur is confirmed to stay, is apparently putting in a word to say, hey, this guy, that guy, I don't know, like, not a big fan of them or the way that things work. Look, Hamilton knows how things were done at Mercedes, and you could argue that as good as Leclerc is, he doesn't have quite that killer instinct, or maybe, is Leclerc a little bit too soft? It maybe is the wrong words, because I think Leclerc can be pretty ice cold, but does Leclerc have the balls to go to Ferrari and say, hey, I think you need to fundamentally change X, Y, Z? Hamilton, frankly, does, and it's also the reason why they paid him all this money, is to try to help them become a winning team. So maybe you listen to him if he's giving you suggestions, and maybe you have no choice, because yes, Hamilton's had a difficult season so far. I still think, he's got 10 attempts to get a podium from now to the end of the season. I think there will be opportunities that arise for him, even if the car is struggling week in, week out, but he may be staying for a very long time. So, rumours emerging in the Italian press, F1 Insider, but also Gazzetta dello Sport or whatever, they were talking about this controversial clause, which apparently is in Hamilton's contract. So, Hamilton is contracted for this year and also for next year in 2026, and you would imagine 2026 and probably 2027, those are the two big years when it comes down to if Hamilton can win an 8th championship. If he doesn't win it in 26 or 27, it's not going to happen, right? Ferrari need to nail the car, Hamilton needs to get along well with the car, and he needs to be at the level to win in that car and also to beat his teammate Charles Leclerc. Those are lots of things to ask, but I wouldn't say it's impossible with a driver of the caliber of Hamilton, certainly in a new era of regulations with presumably some characteristics that favour his inherent driving style slightly more, and with Loic Serra heading up the technical team, designing a car which seems to have more of Hamilton's DNA and side. That's been some of the recent talk. But also there have been some theories about whether if Hamilton doesn't deliver from now to the end of this season, and then also for next year, whether Ferrari would consider, okay, is Hamilton the right man? Is he past it, frankly? Is he not going to be able to deliver us what we need from him? Should we just say, it's been a pleasure, Lewis, great job on the sprint in China, but we're going to move on, right? And we're going to go down a different route and, maybe promote Ollie Behrman, maybe sign somebody else. People would even say bring back Sainz. I don't buy that idea. I think my wonder in this situation, though, would be what if Verstappen is available? Because there is a world where Ferrari nail it next year. Like, they have the best car. Maybe Leclerc wins the title, maybe Hamilton wins the title, who knows? If Hamilton wins his 8th in 2026, I think it's very unlikely, but if he does, he probably just retires on the spot, to be honest. But my point is that Verstappen next year, during 2026, is not expected to have the fastest car. He's certainly not expected to win next year's championship at Red Bull. So Max will be looking, as soon as next year starts, on who's got the best car, where could I go in 2027? If it's Red Bull, then he stays. If it's not Red Bull, which it probably won't be, then where is it? Is it Mercedes? That's why Toto Wolff is not really wanting to give George Russell too long-term of a deal. Could it be McLaren? Potentially. Could it be Ferrari? Now, I don't expect to see Max go to Ferrari, but let's say Ferrari are the best team. Max would presumably want to go there, right? Who doesn't want to drive for Ferrari, especially if they've nailed it in 2026 and 2027 they've potentially got a seat available with, Hamilton, his contract would run out. But whatever the potential scenarios are, it is far from simple, because rumours had it that Ferrari, to get Hamilton, basically gave him whatever he wanted, right? Mercedes didn't want to make him an ambassador for the company. Ferrari were willing to say, you know what, Lewis, we'll give you this amount, we'll give you a blank check, but also if you want to work on these initiatives, if you want this level of power and control, we're willing to do that, because not only are you Lewis Hamilton, but also you're going to help us try and become the winning team that we are intending to once again be. But rumour has it that Hamilton has a clause in his contract which allows him to extend it if he wants to, with no say from the Ferrari side. So report has it that there's a clause in his contract that if Hamilton simply wants to extend, if he decides that he wants to do a third year at Ferrari in 2027, if he thinks maybe he doesn't win in 26, but the car's looking good and he wants to stay on for another year, whatever Ferrari think about it, okay, maybe they could pay him off. But the point is, if Hamilton wants to extend his contract, rumour has it that he can simply decide to do so. This isn't like a 2+1 where, the team has to agree to it. This is a straight up 2+1 where apparently all of the decision is in Hamilton's hands. So if he wants to stay, which he may not, Hamilton's made all these comments about it's not being great, or if he does win the championship next year, or maybe more likely, if Ferrari are just not quite at the races and Hamilton doesn't feel like 2027 is going to be massively different, he may just decide, you know what, it's been a pleasure, but enough is enough. But if he wants to stay, rumour has it, Ferrari have effectively nothing that they can do about it. So very interesting on this one. I don't expect it's going to be a big deal for Ferrari. Even if Hamilton isn't the driver that he used to be, it's still a great driver lineup. And if their car this year was substantially better, then, they'd still be in a very strong position. Antonelli next year may be significantly better. I expect him to be. Red Bull will probably still be a one-driver team. So it's not a real big deal for Ferrari. But if they do end up battling McLaren, let's say, for the championship, and they've got a car which is capable of doing so, or even battling Mercedes and a very strong George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, then, it's obviously a question how strong the drivers are. And Leclerc and Hamilton on paper, one of the strongest driver lineups to ever grace the sport. And I'd still back that. But if Mercedes are coming along and thinking about trying to put Russell and Verstappen together, then maybe there are questions on whether Ferrari should allow that to happen, depending on what the future looks like. I'll also share this, right? This is qualifying data so far this season in terms of average qualifying pace in representative sessions. And Piastri's been just a smidge faster than Norris. Of course, that's the closest gap on the grid, apart from a couple. Albon over Sainz is very marginal, despite Albon scoring way more points this year. And Hülkenberg and Bortoleto have basically been exactly the same pace this season. Hadjar's had a 10th over Lawson. Gasly a couple of tenths on Colapinto, Russell 2.5 tenths on Antonelli, Alonso 3 and a bit tenths on Stroll. Behrman's been faster than Ocon, which to me is very impressive, right? I know it might be British bias, whatever, say what you want, but to me, I'm surprised that Behrman is considered so low in people's rookie rankings. I understand that people rate Bortoleto highly and Hadjar obviously, and like the rookies this year are good, but you know, people have talked about Behrman being like the worst rookie. I just don't buy it at all. Unless you just think Ocon is terrible, which I certainly don't. I think he's, you know, Ocon and Gasly, pretty similar drivers. So as far as I'm concerned, so I think Behrman's done a great job there. Verstappen, the gap on Tsunoda is obviously tragic, but you know, that seems to be the case against anyone. And then Leclerc Hamilton, right? I mean, the gap between them in representative quali pace this season has been a tenth and a half. Again, it's not massive, right? Like, obviously, on occasion, that's resulted in big losses because a tenth and a half in how competitive it is nowadays, that can be a serious difference, as we saw what happened with Yuki back in Hungary. But look, Hamilton's been solid given the circumstances so far this season, and given how good Leclerc is as well. And I don't expect Ferrari would want Hamilton gone by any means, but even if they want to, then apparently they do not have much of a choice. So very much enjoy your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.